The second part of this chapter involves biochemistry. Biochemistry is the study of chemical composition in living matter. So it's most important to us. So chemicals are either categorized into organic or inorganic. Inorganic essentially means they do not have carbon, and they would be things like water, salts, and many acids and bases, which we'll talk about next. After that, we're going to end up talking the rest of the chapter about organic compounds, which contain carbon. And they're usually large and covalently bonded. And there's four different groups: carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and lipids. Lipids are the name for fats, and there is an organic molecule chart on slide 35 that we're going to be using for reference. And it's really good because it kind of breaks down the rest of this chapter, makes it a little easier to learn. But in the meantime, before we get to that, we're going to go through inorganic compounds, and water is the first one. It's the most abundant inorganic compound. It equals 60 to 80% of the volume of the living cells. And remember, it's broken down into things like the extracellular fluid, the intracellular fluid. So some of the important properties of water are shown here. The first one is high heat capacity, and that's because it has the ability to absorb and release heat with little temperature changes. Even if we have a fever, our body temperature doesn't really go up that significantly, which is really a good thing. So that's because water, the plasma, has a high heat capacity. So it prevents sudden changes in body temperature. It also has a high heat evaporization. So that means that evaporation requires a large amount of heat, and it's a useful cooling mechanism. So think about the sweat that's released from our sweat pores as we're cooling back down to reach homeostasis. The third quality is that of polar solvent properties. Remember, when you hear polar, you need to think um, unequal sharing. It would help if I could spell. So polar means unequal sharing, and that describes the water molecule. Remember, it's got oxygen on one side and hydrogen on the other side. So it dissolves and dissociates ionic compounds, forms hydration water layers around larger molecules like cells, membranes, proteins, and it's the major transport medium. And remember, water is the universal solvent. The next quality of water is reactivity because it's used to help to break bonds. When it breaks a bond, that's called hydrolysis. And when water is removed from a bond, it's called dehydration synthesis. So, hydrolysis, water is added, and in dehydration synthesis, water is removed. The last characteristic of water is very important, called cushioning, and this helps to protect certain organs from physical trauma. For example, cerebrospinal fluid, which you'll learn about later in the semester, is going to cushion the brain as well as the spinal cord. So when we look at dissociation of water here, we can see the water molecule has the partial negative side and the partial positive side because of the hydrogens. Whenever water surrounds an ionic compound, like a salt crystal, so sodium and chloride, those it can dissociate. And the word dissociate just means simply to break apart. So the ionic compound breaks apart. So now the ions can be in solution. And an ion is one or more atoms that has a charge. Most of the time in this class, we're only going to be usually talking about one atom, but there's cases of where it's other atoms as well. So here, the negative oxygen reacts with the positive sodium cation. Cation means it's a positively charged ion. Chloride is a negatively charged ion, so it's called an anion, and the positive part of the water interacts with it. So salts, as you know now, are ionic compounds that can dissociate into separate ions in water. So imagine adding some salt crystals to water, shaking it up. What's going to happen is that those salt crystals are going to break apart into individual ions. So they're separated into cations, which are positively charged molecules, and anions, which are negatively charged ions. This does not include hydrogen and hydroxide. So hydrogen we're going to be talking about next, but this is a part of acids and bases. And when we have OH together with a negative charge, it stands for hydroxide and acts as a base. So all ions are electrolytes because they can conduct an electrical current in solution. That's going to be really important in the nervous system. And examples of this are sodium, potassium, calcium, and iron. So they have a charge to them. Sodium is in group 1, so it has one valence electron. It loses that valence electron to have a charge of +1. Potassium is also in group 1, so it has one valence electron, loses that valence electron to have a charge of +1. Calcium is in group 2, so it loses those two valence electrons to have a charge of +2. Iron is kind of a weird one that we're going to ignore because it's in the transition metals in the middle of the periodic table. So you're only really responsible for what's in column 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So ionic balance is vital for homeostasis. Salts in the body would be things like salt, which we've already talked about, calcium carbonate, which is shown here. This is an example of an ion which has more than one atom in it. And then calcium phosphates and potassium chloride. Acids and bases are going to involve hydrogen and hydroxide. So acids and bases are both electrolytes. They ionize and dissociate in water. Ionize basically means they become an ion. So acids are proton donors. They release hydrogen, which is a bare proton. Because remember, hydrogen has no electrons. So hydrogen has one proton, zero neutrons, and zero electrons. So the reason we refer to it as a proton is because that's all it has. So important acids would be really, a lot of times acids begin with an H. So HCl is hydrochloric acid. This one's called acetic acid. You don't need to know the uh, symbols for this. And H2CO3 is called carbonic acid. So if hydrochloric acid is added together, it's actually written with a small l. It's not a big difference, but it breaks apart into hydrogen and chloride. Bases, on the other hand, are proton acceptors. That means they pick up the hydrogen that's in solution. And when the OH is by itself, it's called hydroxide or an hydroxyl ion. Other important bases in the human body are bicarbonate ion and ammonia. And again, bases are going to accept a hydrogen. So what that means is that the H is going to combine with the bicarbonate or with the ammonia to make what's called ammonium.